Well, Gurcharan, it's a pleasure to be with you. To full disclosure, you were on a podcast that I host called Grand Tamasha, where you talked about your memoir and your life, and we've been exchanging emails and notes back and forth. And when Rick kindly introduced us and suggested we do something together, you had an idea that sprung to mind of something we could talk about, something which I have to admit is a bit far afield from my own expertise, but something that's very timely and relevant, which has to do with the nature of warfare and this kind of precarious geopolitical moment that we're in. But I thought maybe we could just start because the way in which you entered this topic and this question I find very interesting, which is, as you recounted to me when we were speaking a few days ago, you're working on an AI book on the Bhagavad Gita. And first of all, I think the listeners might want to know what an AI book is. And second of all, maybe just say something about how, doing this book on the Gita got you to thinking about the nature of kind of modern warfare and the morals and ethics of war.
Well, an AI book is really is a new idea. And one day I got this phone call from a very charming voice on the other side from New York, and this guy says, we are bringing out the classics of the world, and for each classic, we are choosing an author as a guide for the reader. And would you be the guide for a book we would like to bring out on the Bhagavad Gita, which is, of course, the classic of India, and and probably after the Kama Sutra, it's the most sold book about India outside of India. And so essentially they're going to interview me, and they will for up to 20 hours, and they'll ask every conceivable question about the Gita. And then for the reader, that becomes the database for the AI. The reader can pause the book at any time and be encouraged to pause the book and ask a question. And what is dharma? What is sankhya? And so on. And then at the end of each chapter, the reader is encouraged to have a discussion again with the guide, which would be again my voice. They would have both. It could be in audio form or it could be just typewritten, and they could also clone my voice and produce the book in many languages. So it's an AI book. But I feel, I mean, what I told them in advance, that if I'm going to put all that work into writing this book, I'd like to write a conventional book. And the working title of that right now, Milan, is This the Good Life? Reflections on the Gita. So that'll be a book of essays, and Penguin Worldwide will be happy to publish it separately. So now, how I got into the subject we're going to talk to you about today is essentially, Milan, how wars. I mean, I get up in the morning and I see about all the unhappy business of the war between Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, Hamas, Iran, now Iran. There was that short interlude between India, Pakistan.
Correct.
And of course, one feels sort of a moral angst at all this. But what struck me the other day was that we saw how wars had changed. I mean, precision strikes by GPS enabled drones and missiles seem to have replaced soldiers marching and tanks in all these conflicts going on in the world today. It's all high tech, controlled remotely, and frankly, feels like a video game that they are playing, and 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 what struck me particularly about the recent invasion of Iran was how, in the first few days, Iran, Israel took down the top leaders, military leaders, scientists, etc., of the country, and and they were able to do it with these surgical strikes that penetrated through the windows, I imagine, of the homes and offices of these leaders. And it was all done quietly. No, again, no soldiers, uh, no big deal. So what struck me was the question, question of military strategy. That if you could, if these similar such strikes could be targeted early at an enemy leader who is behind, who's instigating the war on the other side, you could, if you could take that person down in this way, you could prevent the conflict from beginning, the war from beginning in the first place. And to imagine that one might avoid the mass suffering that we associate with wars, conventional wars, it would save millions of lives of soldiers, of civilians. I mean, and massive amount of money in defense budgets. It's a seductive thought.
I mean, I mean, I think there's many different ways to kind of, take this thought. But I want to just pick up on something that you said when you were describing the new nature of warfare, which is that it's like a video game. And indeed, when you read the accounts of, say, American drone operators who are sitting in an Air Force base in Arizona, controlling a piece of equipment that's targeting Houthi rebels in Yemen, right? Many of them describe their day to day much like a video game, but it's one that actually, in many cases, and this has been well documented, exacts a pretty significant toll on the people who are playing the quote unquote game, right? And gives them, in many cases, a post traumatic stress disorder because um, you are so far away from the battlefield, yet making decisions with fragments of information that, could quite literally determine life or death. And you're doing this essentially, like a 9 to 5 job, right? Every single day, essentially hunting people down in a way that I think starts to really kind of weigh on people because there's something
Yeah,
disassociating about being sort
right.
of remote. So there are complications related to the kind of video game aspect of this, as I'm sure you know. The second reflection I had on what you said is that you know I think sometimes, and I'm not accusing you of doing this, but I'm saying this is often how soldiers talk or people who are in charge of militaries, whether it's America, Israel, pick your country, that because we have gotten this targeted technology down to such a granular level, it's really remarkable what we're able to do. The example you gave of there's a picture of a building, I think in Tehran, where, just one corner apartment has been targeted. The rest of the building, a building with 300 units, 299 of them are untouched except for this one. But of course, ultimately, this also relies, right, on human fallibility, on human intelligence. There was that infamous episode, I believe, from the bombing of Kosovo, where the United States accidentally put what they call painted the wrong target of a piece of what they thought was something controlled by Milosevic, but in fact, I think was the Chinese embassy, right? And that created a massive diplomatic incident between the two. So it seems like there is possibly there's the reality of precision guided munitions and targeted strikes, but also the reality of human fallibility, which cannot be extricated from this.
Correct. Correct. And that's, I understand what you're saying, but I'm a utilitarian, and and if you see the big picture of wars and read the numbers that have been killed over in Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, etc., and we say, oh God, how awful, etc. Even one life is valuable. However, compare these two, the these 2 years of madness. Compare this to one strike, the firebombing of Dresden in the Second World War, or Tokyo, or the Blitzkrieg in London. That all that killed far more people. And so what I'm saying is that maybe let's look at the upside, of the whole situation. Technology has played a positive part in actually reducing the mass impact that wars did used to have in the past. Um,
I wonder if we could kind of bridge these two threads together, where we started on the Gita and what we just have been discussing with an example, because it's something again that you and I talked about, which the question that arose for you in your mind is, what if the Buddha had
mm,
been Arjuna's charioteer rather than Krishna? So, of course, there's right that the Mahabharata, which is one of the great Hindu epics, is centered around this great conflict between warring kingdoms. And you had Lord Krishna, who was sitting by Arjuna's side, kind of giving him a discourse on dharma and warfare and right and wrong and so on and so forth. And I think that the counterfactual you were imagining is, if Krishna had advised not to launch an all-out war, but instead advised his kind of pupil Arjuna to kill Duryodhan,
Duryodhana, one guy.
instead, there might not have been a war. Just kind of give us a little bit the counterfactual that you were imagining in your mind.
Right. Well, this is, of course, I mean, absolutely correct. That, when I was working on my earlier book, The Difficulty of Being Good, I realized that here was a book that was actually began its life, the Mahabharata, the epic, the great Indian epic. It started its life as a war epic celebrating the soldier, the commander. It's called Jaya in its first, and this was just soon after the Buddha's death. This was begun. And the Mahabharata evolved as a text over centuries. And and I, in my book, I tried to show that actually a war epic became an anti-war epic. And similarly, I tried to imagine with the Gita. Most people take the Gita as a lesson that, you know, you got to go, do your duty. If you are a commander, you got to go and fight. Imagine asking if Eisenhower says that just before the Normandy landings that I don't want to fight. I mean, if he tells that to his driver? What do you think his driver is going to say to him? And so I'm imagining this is I mean it's thought game that I'm imagining that really um, the what's behind the whole. And you see what makes this is what makes India very interesting, and that we have the Gita. Here was a text that Mahatma Gandhi, the great apostle of peace and non-violence, He took that message of peace and non-violence from the Gita. And at the same time, there was Himmler in Germany who used to use the Gita to train the SS officers. Both carried with them the Gita every day. Now, imagine a text, I mean, it's a tribute to the text also, that it can lend itself in this way. But it's a bizarre idea that here's a text that can, and it says something about, I think, also about India and Hinduism, where we have 360 million gods, 330 million gods, sorry. And the Hindu will say, yes, we have 330 million gods, but we also have one God,
Right.
meaning one. They all are symbols of that one
Correct.
God. So this is the nature of what this whole, how I got into all this. And frankly, I then went on, uh, Milan, to imagine that what if the Allies had made a determined effort to, early in the war, to bring down Hitler and the top Nazi leaders? They might have actually prevented World War II and saved how many? 50 million lives. That the war. I mean, that's something worth doing. I thought to myself, and you might have prevented perhaps the war was to end all wars. So
I mean, I think one of the principles that's come up thus far is this idea of Raj Dharma, right? Sort of the duty of the king. And if you kind of take your hypothetical that we've been discussing, obviously utilitarians kind of using a kind of Bentham like, logic would say, look, we believe in the greatest good for the greatest number. This is a trade-off worth making. Again, supporters of the idea of Raj Dharma would believe that, look, we need to take action that benefits the mass of the people, right? Even if
yeah,
we might incur short-term costs. But again, here too, Raj Dharma is a contested concept, right? I mean, I'm thinking back to that infamous example of the 2002 Gujarat riots, right? Where famously, then Prime Minister Vajpayee had, instructed Narendra Modi to follow his Raj Dharma in terms of how he handled things.
yeah,
Now, I think Modi would have replied, maybe did reply, we don't necessarily know his side of the conversation, that he was following his Raj Dharma because his objective function may have been very different than Vajpayee's, given where he was sitting and so on and so it
yeah,
seems to me that this also presents a
yes,
bit of a problem that
yes,
going
yes.
back to your
Can
your, your Gandhi Himmler comparison.
right. Well, exactly. I think you're absolutely right. And and I'd like to discuss the other side of this
Yeah.
story, because you're right that if you are going to be guided by, if the greatest good for the greatest number idea, you do have to worry about minorities in a country. And we have certainly learned this in the last half dozen more years. And so this idea, I mean, it's an attractive idea that if you attack the root cause of war, you eliminate the tyrant who is instigating the conflict, you you do so much good. You lower defense budgets, for God's sakes, free up funds to improve people's lives through education, health, etc., and so on. Now, I mean, technology is makes it much more doable than ever. And this is why actually the secret services, in fact, of some of the countries haven't been engaged in these covert operations. I mean, this is how terrorists of Al Qaeda and ISIS were eliminated. So, I mean, my thought was, and I want to come back to
Yeah.
your question, philosophical question against utilitarianism, but I just want to say why I was kind of seduced into this idea that before you begin the next war, doesn't it make sense for a government to consider this option before letting loose armies, navies, air forces on? So this is now to answer. I mean, I think you made a very valid point that there are strong arguments against targeted assassination. First of all, it's extrajudicial killing. It's it violates all our present laws and moral norms. It undermines the rule of law and sets dangerous precedents. It's likely to result in greater mistrust in between countries and also risks retaliation. I mean, as a leader, I'm thinking of attacking, taking down your leader, but they'll attack, they'll go after me, and so that's another risk. And frankly, in the case, I mean, in the present situation, you're also dealing with ideology which has seeped deep into the minds of the people. And so you risk martyrdom, chaos, and immediately, as we've seen in Iran, successors are ready to take
Correct.
over. Um, and you've seen you tried it in the case of Gaddafi up in Libya. The successors turned out to be much worse than there. And so, for this reason, even when Churchill, and for these reasons, for Churchill and Churchill and Roosevelt, actually later in the war, considered taking down Hitler, but they didn't follow through. And perhaps because of this, um, but yes, now I want to come back to your point about utilitarianism and because frankly I read in college uh, the great book of Immanuel Kant.
Mm.
You it was in a class actually given by Rawls at Harvard, where I was an undergraduate, and
And you're
and
talking about perpetual peace.
and it perpetual peace, exactly. I mean, we all became converts of Immanuel Kant, uh, and and Immanuel Kant, basically his idea was um, that that you try and the attempt of the world for the future ought to be to create a federation of nations, some kind of union, so that, I mean, the idea was to eliminate wars, and through this confederation of nations, not a world government, but maybe a bit like the UN idea. And in fact, Kant's idea that if you created that, you might eliminate these kind of wars. But and in fact, he it was the inspiration. His ideas were the inspiration for the League of Nations, as you may know. Of course, the League of Nations failed. It was the inspiration for the United Nations, but the UN too had a very mixed record of preventing wars in the future. And so the fact is, I mean, our moral sense is offended by the idea of. Uh, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that ultimately one has to use one's moral imagination, um, as we talked earlier, Gandhi has played a big role in in in, uh, in the minds of Indians, and to in the, to teach the idea of ahimsa, which is non-violence. And he won. He helped win India's independence without shedding an ounce of blood, actually, which is quite an extraordinary thing. And it happened under the shadows of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao.
Yeah.
So so it is. I'm just agreeing with you that there are strong reasons uh, to worry, about an idea like the kind that I have been talking about.
I mean, one of the objections to the idea is, there are certain rules and norms associated with what has come to be known as the kind of liberal international order.
That's right.
And what I find, and particularly I find this when I speak with my Indian friends, um, as I had the chance to do last week when there were a group of them visiting the United States on a bit of a kind of a fact-finding mission to get a sense of the new administration, is, one of their kind of lines which they I hear repeatedly, and I think it's worth really interrogating, is that there is this kind of liberal rules-based order, except it's turned out it hasn't been very liberal. The rules have been rather flexible, and it hasn't provided a great deal of order. So, other than that, it's been great. And so, I wonder how you feel about that, because one of there's a kind of slippery slope potentially where, if you take this argument to its logical conclusion, then there's nothing stopping an adversarial country from, say, attacking the United States because it feels that it is complicit in genocide in Gaza, or it has unlawfully bombed Iran, despite the fact that there were negotiations ongoing, there was IEA inspections, and so on and so forth. Um, but that objection is premised a bit on this idea that the liberal rules-based international order is still intact, and I think any ordinary person who's not a political scientist or a philosopher or an author or a business executive who are to listen to this conversation might think, well, that's a fiction anyway, isn't it? So in that
Yeah.
sense,
Well,
are we living in a different era where, in fact, that order doesn't really exist in the way that maybe we might
yeah,
have thought in 1945 or even 1965 or 1985?
yeah, and even in 2025, frankly, Milan, I think these critics of that last 75, 80 years of that order should really sit back, because I happen to think this is has been one of the best periods in world history. Imagine, I mean, just speaking for India, China, just India and China, between them, it has lifted 1.3 billion people out of poverty. Can you imagine any period in human history that has been able to achieve this? And it is partly because of the peace, partly because of the globalization that it was able to spawn, partly because the institutions which we criticize today, WTO, etc., a rules-based order. Yes, they're all, I mean, some of the flaws were always there. But
Yeah,
let's look at the big picture.
yeah,
The big picture, frankly, and there were so few wars, and there were very limited wars. We're not, and when talking about the kind of wars that happened in the night, every year there was a war. And I was talking about Kant earlier, and Kant, as I said, he's inspired League of Nations, he inspired United Nations. That book, Perpetual Peace, also inspired the European Union. And frankly, the European Union, with all its flaws, there it was one of the missions was to not have war between European countries. There was a war every year earlier, and now you can't imagine a war between France and Germany. I mean, there has been no war in Europe since the European Union began. So, to speak about the liberal order, etc., I thought I'd just express my thoughts to you that uh, free trade and democracy spread around the world, and they, with all the flaws of democracy and markets, they created a world. And because liberal the liberal order is was such a good idea. I mean, they were hardly. It's such a good idea that I think, look, liberalism fought against much worse enemies. It defeated fascism. It defeated communism. I think it's going to come out okay at some point in the
So,
future.
I mean, I just to kind of think about the current political moment, right? I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, which is if you think about the gains that countries like India and China have made, in the last several decades, right? I mean, they've been of kind of historic proportions. We've seen clearly a decline in interstate conflict, notwithstanding kind of recent events, but I think the trend is pretty clear. And in fact, in a lot of ways, even just generalized political violence is, according to many scholars, approaching historic lows. But I guess my question is, why isn't this consensus then reaching down or penetrating into the grassroots, right? Because I think if you think about the election of Donald Trump, right? I mean, in a sense, that reflects a dissatisfaction with this idea of kind of free trade, of, a US backed liberal order. Even frankly, take the other side of the political spectrum. We had a kind of a political earthquake in the city of New York, where we had Zoran Mamdani, the son of two prominent South Asians, Mahmoud Mamdani, the scholar, and Mira Nair, the filmmaker, win the Democratic primary to be the next mayor of New York. And part of his campaign was things aren't the best that they've ever been. And in fact, there are deep seated structural inequalities that require the state to play a much more active role. And in fact, to take a step back from what he would say in his words was an over reliance. We can quibble with that on the market. So I wonder, your optimism and my optimism, frankly, about the last several decades is hit
Yeah.
against this tidal wave of people who feel very differently. And I'm wondering how, as somebody who's thought a lot about this, not just the Indian context, how you reconcile the two.
Well, you're right. Absolutely. The From both sides, there have been criticism, and the rise not only of Trump but of Putin, the dictators, other places, Orban in Brazil and other places in India, Modi, and so on. The national movement of nationalism. We seem to be going back to, but when you think about it, we keep going back to a tribal kind of age, and when you think about it, Milan, it also does really reflect on the flaws of liberalism. The the on the one hand, the the left is opposed to the inequality, uh, and certainly markets. And certainly it's existed. I mean, while may celebrate how India is rising and China is rising, and how im- we still have a huge amount of inequality. But let's not measure inequality. Let's measure opportunity
Yeah.
with growth and with there is a rise. The middle class has grown from 10% to 30%. in India, to China to 60% in China. So the there is inequality. Uh, on the right, where the basic flaw of liberalism is that it's individualistic. It doesn't value community enough. And that's true.
Hmm.
When in fact, the rise of Hindu nationalism is partly a desire for community. We've been ruled for too long by people who sort of uh, didn't think that was so important, but people want that need. They have a need. It's not enough just to cheer for the Indian cricket team and
Hmm.
express your uh, sort of solidarity in that way. So this is a sobering idea, and it's a flaw in in liberalism, and liberals uh, need to find ways of correcting it.
I mean, what's so striking, Gurcharan, if we just pause on India, which is a country that you and I, you know, both care a lot about, and you are a citizen of. I am not, but I am. My parents immigrated from India to the United States decades ago, and it's a country that I study very closely. I think about the present moment and I think about the future of liberalism, right? And if you just focus on one aspect of liberalism that you've written extensively about, which is the idea that, there should be a proper balance between the state and the market, and that we have to have a role for the state to provide essential public goods, to collect tax revenue, to arbitrate disputes, to provide safety, health, and education. But otherwise, we need to really unshackle the private sector to create growth and prosperity that will lift all boats. And that's what happened after the liberalization moment. And you've written a great book, India Grows at Night, spelling that out in great deal. It's my favorite of your books, in fact, because it's ultimately about state capacity and the form of state capacity that one needs to
Yeah.
facilitate prosperity. But when I look at the political landscape in India, and you can pick any political party of any political persuasion, be it the Congress, be it the BJP, be it the Aam Aadmi Party, any kind of left or right distinction, I don't see any inheritor of that argument or that tradition, right?
Uh,
I was reading this a book several months ago by Aditya Balasubramaniam on the
yeah.
Swatantra Party. I'm sure you've read it.
Yes.
It's a fabulous book. It's
Yes. And
for
I was a
listeners out
member
there.
of
Yeah.
the Swatara
And
Party.
and 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 this was a party that had a principled kind of market-based kind of
Yeah.
ideology. And as many people have lamented, there's really no inheritor to that particular mantle. And I wonder if you think that that's just a blip in time, that eventually the rough and tumble of politics and the ideological churn will produce that, because it's ultimately what's going to get us back to the kind of booming growth years, or do you feel like that's not necessarily the equilibrium where we will end up?
Well, I mean, one thing, it's a shame. We need opposition. Democracy needs opposition. And unfortunately, we don't have a decent opposition. And this is actually true in many countries as well. If you had had a stronger opponent to Mr. Trump, you may have actually, he may have had a harder time getting elected. But these are what ifs. What you need in a democracy is a vibrant opposition. And that's one of the reasons for the rise of the present dispensation. Uh, However, in favor of what this government has been doing in India, it's actually played uh, the kind of thing you are talking about. That
Mm,
it's during COVID and even now, 800 million people in India are fed free every day. They get free food. Now that's we can talk about the safety net for the poorest, but to have free food is is in a poor country is something. So the point is, I don't, and I think our problem, of course, is that the politics is all around freebies, that
Yeah.
I'm offering you this and I'm offering you this, and the candidate, liberal candidate, stands no chance against another one who says, I'm giving you free electricity. And the liberal says, oh, he goes to the election booth. I mean, his campaign is about, oh, look, I'm going to create conditions for investment, and there'll be jobs and factories, and everybody will benefit from that. And the voter is going to say, look, the day when your government comes to power, the other side is going to give me free electricity, and you'll be gone by the time I get the benefits of, you know, uh, all this investment and growth and good schooling, good schools, and all that you'll invest in. So it's a hard sell, frankly, because people are cynical everywhere about politicians and their motives, and it's a problem of democracy. But however, nevertheless, you've raised a very good question that um, the future in India specifically is that we may have become the fastest growing major economy in the world, but we still have not created the jobs that we
Right.
should have created. And the fact is, we still have not created an industrial revolution. We've kind of skipped from a green revolution, where
Yeah.
we're now the fourth largest exporter of agriculture,
Yeah.
farm produce, to an IT revolution
Yeah.
that we are. That's the strong suit of India. And that's so the point is, almost half the people are still on the farm,
Yeah.
45% of the population, and they can only be lifted up through an industrial revolution.
Yeah.
And what we need today is really in India, this nationalistic mood, the government tried to create a program called Atmanirbhar, Make in India, like Trump is trying to make in
Right.
America, and he's making the same mistakes that we made. High tariffs, and of course, and depending totally on in our case, we're depending totally on the Indian industry. Now, Indian industries have done a good job, but they are not world beaters. And so the world brands, I mean, the best example today for India, which we should follow, is iPhone. I
Yeah.
end up, people, Apple got worried by China and what it was doing and what was happening. And so it shifted. It was 100% of the Chinese
Yeah.
production was in China of Apple, of phones. And they slowly started. In India, the first year, they made 15% of the production, and now it's increasing every day, and it's just 15% production of iPhones created 150,000 direct jobs. 70% of the jobs were for women, and 4 indirect jobs for every direct jobs. That's so 600,000 jobs. Now they're going to probably triple that in the next few years. And as component manufacturers come in, you'll get a much. That's the way to do it. If I were the chief minister of any state in India, I'd go. I'd go to Nike. I'd go to all the big labor intensive manufactured consumer brands. And I would go and tell them what a great place India is to invest. And
But
don't depend.
Gurcharan, just to I think clearly, if you look at the aggregate numbers, right, it's very clear that industry's share or manufacturing share of GDP, despite 10 plus years of the Make in India program, has not budged. India has tried very many things, increasing tariffs, staying aloof from these mega regional trading agreements, it's subsidizing production through something called production linked incentives, all sorts of schemes. And I think they've all come to the conclusion that really none of this has really worked the way we would like. But there is a success story, which is the state of Tamil Nadu. And I've been struck by reading some on this, including by people like Arvind Subramaniam, who happens to be from that place and knows it well, saying that, when we think about the manufacturing miracle that India wants to bring about or emulate, it's actually happening in that state, right? You're seeing Korean footwear companies, you're seeing Vietnamese garment companies. And this kind of threw up an astonishing statistic, which is I think 40% of all women who are employed on the factory floor are working in that one state, right? Which is just mind-boggling when you think of it as it's a large state, but given the size of India, I mean,
Yeah,
punching way, way above its weight. So it does seem to me that there is a path and a model perhaps for emulating. Obviously, Tamil Nadu has a set of historic and political and other conditions. It's
yeah,
more industrialized, it's richer, it has a tradition of social activism, of caste-based movements, and so on and so forth. But um, you know, going back to the what you said earlier, if I were king, right? My charge would be for all other states to figure out what the elements of Tamil
yeah,
Nadu's success are and to try to scale them up.
correct. And it's you are absolutely right. And why, for example, did Apple choose Tamil Nadu to make the iPhones?
Yeah.
And so, and and when when the Prime Minister of Vietnam heard that they'd lost the iPhone to India rather than coming to Vietnam, he took a flight to Cupertino, California, and he talked to that CEO, Mr. Cook, and he said to him, "Now look, we've lost the iPhone, but would you give us the tablet?" And he tried to, and
Yeah.
he got it, and he got it. So if I were a chief minister of another state, that's I would emulate. You don't wait. You have to be proactive and say. And Tamil Nadu has those advantages, but other states also understand this. Maharashtra, Gujarat, Andhra, Karnataka, these states understand this idea. But they need to be, no one has, I mean, China taught the world this lesson. And I think we should all learn it from them. And India's in terms of, and if you ask me, the irony is today, I believe Trump is our best friend because he's forcing us to lower tariffs,
Yeah.
which have been the major deterrent. Because if we want to become a global manufacturer, we want to join the supply chains, global value chains, as they're called, we need to bring down the tariffs. And he is making us do what we should be doing on our own. And so, unlike other countries which may be moaning and groaning about him, I feel that he's good for India. And so, um, yeah, I mean, and that's actually, if every you're absolutely right that there is a path. Apple phones has shown the path again to India. India has done a lot more since 1991. Its infrastructure is far better now than it was in 1991. The road mileage has actually doubled
Yeah.
in India since 2011. Um, the port handling capacity is quadrupled. So the sort of digital
Right.
revolution, India has got one of the largest number in the world of digital transactions, and all that has taken a lot of the friction out of the system. We still have to do reforms, etc. Some of them, but I believe at least this government has shown more capability in that direction, I'm afraid, than no opposition leader, sorry to say, in the last 10 years has talked about this. All they've done is talk about pocket money for housewives and that sort of thing. And so it's not as from an economic standpoint. I think we are on the verge of it another takeoff, and it can come.
I
It
want to
can come.
just come back to something that we discussed a second ago, but I think is relevant to this conversation, which is, when you study the histories and the examples of some of the East Asian countries, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, even China, frankly, for that matter, one of the critical elements that's clear in their success story, and there are plenty of books and international organizations like the World Bank which have laid this out, is a, a serious and significant early investment in human capital, specifically primary education and primary health. And we know, we don't need to recount here for the listeners, India's rather abysmal record on those counts, although one could make the case that at least in terms of um, certain outcomes, enrollment, literacy, maternal mortality, infant mortality, things, or nutrition, or things are headed in the right direction. But there's certainly a big gap. Now, getting to the art of democracy and the politics of it, I'm struck again by how little conversation there has been in the
Yeah.
public discourse about the need to deliver these things. And there are many reasons why, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
short-term horizons, short-time horizons. If you're only in power for 4 or 5 years, it may not be enough, even if you make the best investments for you to reap the benefits that they will fall to your successor. There's the credibility issue, right? Because so many voters look at political parties as not credible when it comes to delivery of this kind. They find them much more credible when it comes to clientelism or handouts or so on and so forth. There's a distrust or trust deficit, which then has reverberations. But in at least one place, which is the place I think you are right now, which is New Delhi, we've had one political party, no longer in power, the Aam Aadmi Party, which did at least try to put education on the agenda. It's no longer in power, so one might take away from that they didn't deliver on their promises or it didn't quite strike the
No.
voter. But I
Yeah.
am curious as to whether you think that given the basics about democracy and the median voter and the kind of hierarchy of human needs, that sooner rather than later, there is an opening for a political entrepreneur, a political party to
Yeah.
actually make health and
Yeah.
education, let's just pick those two because they're the
Yes. Yeah.
easiest to kind of conceptualize, as a building block for a new political
Right.
movement. And I wonder whether you think that's naive or whether you think
No. No.
there's
No.
actually
No.
an opportunity there.
Yeah. I mean, I've been asking myself this question that, and unfortunately, Aam Aadmi Party let us down ultimately. Uh, However, the idea, I would love to see the day where you could get votes by saying that I'll create great schools, I'll help create great schools. Now, to the defense of the present situation, I would say, I've been actually quite involved in the education area. I support, and I mean, I'm part of, I've been the director of Center for Civil Society, which is a liberal think tank focused on education reform. And I work also with the Central Square Foundation, the which was set up by my friend Ashish Dhawan, who was the founder of Ashoka University. Now, all this has made me realize that actually a silent revolution is underway. And it was triggered, oddly enough, by a man called, it was triggered partly by what is not very well known, not in the public, not a mass kind of thing, but Kasturi Rangan. And it's the new education policy. After 75 years, India had a new education
Yeah.
policy. And the key plank of that policy was we have to get rid of this rote learning system and go into an inquiry based learning system. And there's been a mission I mean, government has created this mission, and a number of NGOs are working with them. And I've seen their work. And UP actually is an example. First time the ASSER reports showed finally a turnaround in literacy. ASA reports, by Pratham is
Of
an
course,
annual
yeah.
assessment. So I'd look into this area. I personally feel that there are efforts being made, and it's worth looking into what UP oddly enough has achieved. There was a very up, up, outstanding IAS officer who actually was making that miracle. Now, this is just to say that there, and the other point to make, Milan, is that about 20, well, the fact is that only about 20-25% of Indians really get a decent education. And they're the people that, have gone on to the IITs, gone on to Silicon Valley, they've become CEOs
Sure.
of companies in the world. And so it's these are also models of success, which the present system has spawned. And in the numbers in India are such that even a small number of people can create a miracle like
Right.
Bangalore and in the cyber city in Hyderabad and all these places. So if you take the bigger picture in this, I would say you're absolutely right. There's no bigger angst I feel that or
Hmm.
live a missed opportunity of the last 75 years through of education, health. I think I would follow the reform, the model of the 20 baht reforms in Thailand, which would be perfect for it.
You know,
But that
one
that's a subject for another day.
One thing, maybe this is a good place to kind of end on, is just, I think one of the things that we haven't really unpacked, but it's kind of underneath one layer and kind of everything we've talked about is institutions, right? And I think there's been, as you know better than I, a real revolution in the field of social science, but economics specifically, about understanding the pivotal role that sound institutions play in determining whether a country is able to achieve a path to prosperity. And this, is work of Douglas North and Acemoglu and Robinson, recent Nobel Prize winners in economics. And, one of the things that I've been struck by observing the American example, but I think this is true also in the Indian example, is um, we've seen how fragile institutions can become when the norms underpinning them come undone, right? For instance, there was never a law that if you stand for the presidency of the United States, you must disclose your income tax returns, right? That was a norm. It was a shared norm. In fact, lawmakers never thought to codify it because they assumed that who would ever want to break that taboo? And of course, we now have a president who has broken that taboo, and there are numerous such examples. Um, but coming
Yeah,
back
and
to
sorry, just to
yeah,
to underline your point that I mean the way he's going after my university, Harvard,
right.
and I mean, we thought institutions were stronger in America. We looked to America's institutions as an example of what we want to create. I still think, I mean, there is a pushback in the U.S., but it's been a bit disappointing. And for me, this a great part of the disappointment is our own judiciary. Um, and let's not get into that.
Well,
Uh,
but I guess the reason I came to think of it is one is that you realize that institutions are really contingent, norm contingent, right? But just specifically thinking about education, there's this fabulous work done by a political scientist named Akshay Mangla, who you might be familiar with, who tries to understand why certain states in India are able to do a better job of delivering primary education and others are not. And he takes norms very seriously. And what he's uncovered is, you essentially have two types of norms that get embedded within the state bureaucracy. You have a set of what he calls legalistic norms, which are very much around compliance and checklists and making sure that you, as a district education officer, do the following 10 things so that you can show, the person sitting in the state capitol that you have done those 10 things, and you in turn have a block development officer, a block education officer has a list of 75 things, and it becomes almost sort of a rote box ticking exercise. But you also have places which have a kind of more deliberative norms, right? Where in fact there is a kind of give and take between high level bureaucrats and the implementers, such that um, the deliberation over problem solving, over troubleshooting, is able to actually create resilient institutions. And so,
Yeah.
in a state like Himachal Pradesh, for instance, where you see much more of this deliberation, you're actually able to produce better educational outcomes than in other states where you're still operating across along this kind of more traditional hierarchical line. And that gives me some optimism, Gurcharan, because it tells you that, in fact, these are bodies which exist on paper. They're designed the same ways, but under one set of norms triggered by, the kind of leadership and a way of social interaction, you can
Yeah.
actually move from
Yeah.
a negative sum equilibrium to a positive
Yeah.
sum equilibrium.
But, and also I think here the lesson, we Indians are very reluctant to learn lessons from others. But if you realize that um, um, China, when they did their
Right,
reforms, they also reformed the incentive system in their bureaucracy.
right,
And they made the bureaucrats much more accountable
right.
for investment, jobs, and growth at the lowest levels. And we never. And I mean, also China. Look at England. I mean, look at UK. When Margaret Thatcher came in, most of us think of her as as an economic reformer, but she did a lot to reform the bureaucracy.
Right,
And in fact, our reformers didn't even bother to sell the reforms to the people, let
right,
alone the bureaucracy.
right.
And so the accountability is, I think, a very key issue you've you've underlined. And but why don't we come back before we close
Yeah,
to where we started? And where
we've
do we
traveled a
go?
long distance.
Yeah. So where do we go with this? With this nice seductive idea of um, a world without wars and the possibility. I mean, we discussed the pros and cons of the idea of a targeted assassination of a tyrant who is instigating the war, but we also talked about the damage this could bring, and certainly the damage could be to the domestic politics, because it could give a license to kill domestic political opponents
Yeah,
or business opponents. So you don't want to give that kind of message at all. But when I think about it, and even although though the idea has not been really tried, except in this very small scale of uh, taking down the leadership of ISIS and Al Qaeda and Mossad's other activities in Munich and so on, where this has succeeded, I still believe that this should not be dismissed. It should be part of the toolkit of a leader after that leader has tried umpteen times, maybe the way Krishna tried in the Mahabharata, tried to negotiate diplomatic means, etc. If all else fails, before pressing the button for war, there can be contingent. I mean, it's a contingent thing. It depends on the circumstances, etc. But it it is something that a leader should think about before pressing. It should have a very high bar, and I mean to do it. It should be as a thought that instead of going to war, can we just eliminate one or a few people who are causing the whole problem, who are the root cause? I just want to leave it at that thought. I think it's ultimately it's fraught. It's moral hazard for fraught with moral hazard. Um, so what do you think?
No, I mean, I think, I mean, obviously it's a very difficult question to come up with any definitive answers. I mean, my sense, Gurcharan, is that when you kind of look at, what people call the revolution in military affairs, right, which is this kind of deepening nexus between technology and warfighting, we are essentially coming to this destination through trial and error and innovation, right? Whereby
Yeah,
um, you can actually target things to such a level to minimize
yeah. You're already
uh,
minimizing the damage of
the
old
the
damage
the the
or
d- the difficulty. I think is
the
one.
mass damage.
There are a handful of countries in the world that have the kind of state capacity and the resources to carry out
Yeah.
such things because, as
Right.
we've seen, right, these are not technologies that are necessarily widely shared. Um, I think there is obviously a slippery slope as we've discussed. For instance, India would say that by conducting targeted killings of Khalistani separatists in Canada and the United States, or attempted killings in the case of the United States, they were seeking to do this. Now, I think many people would push back and say, well, Khalistan wasn't actually a live threat, but then, the counter argument is, India had to deal with an
Yeah.
insurgency in Punjab for quite a long time. So I think you're never going to be able to get out of that circularity. I still think at the end of the day, one of the reasons, going back to the liberal order, we have evolved institutions as dysfunctional as they've become, like the United Nations, was to provide some semblance of legitimacy or an imprimatur of assent to take certain actions, right? And I think that is going to be badly needed even as we adopt these technologies because of the scope for them to potentially kind of run amok and be used on domestic political enemies and so on and so forth, right? So I think while it mitigates some of the risks, it doesn't take us out of the larger problem we're in, which is to have some kind of global forum whereby these
Yeah.
decisions can be made. Because if they're only done by the United States or by Israel or by the European Union or by India or China, you will always face this question of, whether or not they're wholly legitimate.
And this brings us, of course, back to Kant's ideal of a kind of a world, uh, in other words, strengthening the world institutions that were under the American promoted second
Yeah,
world liberal order, and and that's correct. I mean that you're absolutely right. And for me, the shining light really on this is the EU. EU has been so far. Um, when I see that the how the Europe was, if you read European history
yeah,
in the 19th
yeah,
century, there was a war every year,
right.
somewhere or the other, and I just think it's possible. Now we have gone into a world that rejects. There's the hegemony of the United States has been, uh, and Mr. Trump has not helped in that, and multipolar polarity. I mean, I still feel that uh, Deepak Lal wrote a book in praise of empires. And what he was actually praising was the first liberal order under the British in the 19th century and this post-war American liberal order, because you had peace. Now, our the fundamental sense of human beings, of course, is opposed to the idea that of one hegemon, and certainly British colonialism was reviled thought today. So one doesn't know where the world is
Yeah.
going, but the little bit that we have talked about today, one, if I may take a few positive notes in ending this thing, one is that how technology has turned out to be our best friend. We are all scared of AI in the future, etc. Um, and we are worried about technology. But here, in this instance, we've actually seen the difference between the conventional wars and the present precision targeted kind of warfare, which mass suffering is much less.
Yeah.
So that's good. And it was really uh, and also I think we are dismissing the benefits of this particular order that's unraveled and unraveling. Uh, it's been the best, I think, is the best period in human history that we've
Well,
had.
as with many things, once it's gone, you will realize how much you missed it, right? I mean, I was speaking to some former Indian diplomats, just to end on a bit of a light note, who were discussing, the trials that India faces with the current dispensation in Washington. And one of them said, we just didn't know how good we had it under the Biden administration, despite all of the
Well,
difficulties that we thought we
yeah,
had. Not leaving your trade issue aside, I agree that
yeah,
Trump could be a nice external anchor for domestic reform, but I think on a
right,
whole range of other things, they're potentially
yeah.
rockier times ahead. But of course, that revelation is typically only to be found in the aftermath or with hindsight. But Gurcharan, I just want to thank you for engaging in this conversation. It's been a lot of fun for me. I've always learned so much from reading you and from speaking with you and kind of hearing your musings on all sorts of issues. So I'm glad we had this opportunity.
Thank you, Milan. I've enjoyed it. And do send me the link to that book you were talking about on institutions. That sounded
And
something I
education.
haven't read. On yeah, or in Himachal and other
Yes,
things
I
that
will do
to
so. I will do it right away.
okay.
Thanks very much.